Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Shinapeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight with many thanks to McGill-Queen's University Press to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Ukrainian Ritual on the Prairies, Growing a Ukrainian Canadian Identity by Natalie Kononenko. I won't take up too much of your time right out at the outset, and I will apologize in advance for my clumsy Mennonite tongue when it comes to representing any Ukrainian terms. I will also point out the fact that, unlike Natalie, who has the entire presentation in her head, I will rely on this piece of paper, so shamefully enough. Just a few quick procedural notes before we begin. There will be a presentation from up here, following which there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. If you do have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll come over to you with the microphone, Phil Donahue style, which is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that all those watching at home can hear the questions and prevents us from having to repeat them. If you are one of those people watching from home, please feel free to just write your questions in the chat on the YouTube, and we will get to them as time permits. Now, just a little bit about the book, and then I will return at the end to go over some exciting details about signing procedure. Canada is home to one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in the world, yet little is known about the life and culture of Ukrainians living in the country's rural areas and their impact on Canadian traditions. Kononenko's new book draws on more than 10 years of fieldwork and interviews to give voice to rural Ukrainian Canadians and their accounts of family rituals, those of marriage, birth, and death, and rituals connected to the calendar, namely Christmas and Easter. Kononenko highlights the creative accomplishments of these people in developing a culture that is both Ukrainian and Canadian. She gives voice to a group of everyday people who are too often overlooked. Natalie Kononenko received her PhD from Harvard University. Her dissertation was based on her fieldwork in Turkey. She has also done work in Ukraine, Canada, and Kazakhstan. Her book, Ukrainian Minstrels and the Blind Shall Sing, won the Kovalev Prize and the Best Book Award at the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. Her Ukrainian epic and historical song, Folklore in Context, received the Barbara Hite Award for Best Translation. I mispronounced that. Helt Award for Best Translation. She has also authored other books and numerous articles. She was an award-winning teacher and is a pioneer in digital humanities, creating both popular and scholarly websites, including one with all of the interviews conducted in Canada. It's my great pleasure to invite you to welcome Natalie Kononenko.
You can sit up there in the front. Thank you, everyone. If we can turn on the projector, which we will in a second. Thank you very much for coming. As you'll see at the end, I'm very interested in getting people to know about the prairies and about Prairie Canadians. The problem being, of course, that this is a group that's very much ignored. I didn't know about them till, what was it, about 15 years ago. We started the project. Well, the project took 10 years. And as soon as we get this going, are we good?
Yeah. We're good to go.
Can we advance?
If you just point directly at the laptop.
Maybe you.
Oh, there we go.
Aha.
Just being a little difficult.
Yeah, so it is the button that I think.
Absolutely.
Okay, so why I did this book, all authors are going to tell you, why? What got me going? I'm on the mic now, which is probably better, especially for broadcasting. I'm a child of Ukrainian refugees. My granddad, who is shown with little bitty me in this picture, was very much of a nationalist, and he was also an agrarian economist teaching at the University of Kharkiv in Ukraine. Well, at that point, criticizing Soviet agrarian policy right about the time, it was actually before the time of the Holodomor, was not a good idea. For those of you who know about the Holodomor, it was a Ukrainian famine, and so since my grandfather was critical of policy, he got arrested once and twice and all of that sort of stuff. And at some point, the family decided that if grandpa got arrested, he wasn't a grandpa then, but if he got arrested again, he wasn't going to make it. And they headed west. They were in Poland for a while. They quite literally walked across Europe. And I was born in a DP camp. A DP camp is a displaced persons camp. It's sort of like what refugee camps are today. If you ever run into my 6'2" son, having seen my barely 5'6" husband, you'd probably guess that the tall genes are mine, except for the fact that I starved, well, we all starved in the DP camp. My family, because of all of this, moved westward. We ended up in Woolton, New Jersey, where I grew up. We were sponsored by a group of Ukrainian nationalists who, because of my grandfather and his prominence and his role at that time, were very interested in sponsoring him. Well, being sponsored by a group of Ukrainian nationalists has its drawbacks. So growing up, they exerted an enormous amount of pressure on me to be a good Ukrainian in terms of language, in terms of appearance, and groups that I would join, and on and on and on. And language, I had to have Ukrainian purity, and language is a particular issue. You know why? Because nobody spoke like Ukrainian. Ukrainian wasn't taught at schools. Ukrainian wasn't taught anywhere. Where was I supposed to learn Ukrainian? And these nationalists would give me a hard time, a terrible time. I call this the Avramenko syndrome, and that's a picture of Avramenko. The pointer doesn't work either, oh well. Okay, we're not going to worry about this. That's a picture of Avramenko. He started, as many of you probably know, Ukrainian dance companies all over Canada and into the United States. Why I call it the Avramenko syndrome was because Avramenko insisted, if you're a good Ukrainian, he insisted on a certain type of purity. Not only could people that were participating in his group not drink, not smoke, they couldn't chew gum. Okay, this was not Ukrainske, you shouldn't do this sort of stuff. When I was out doing my interviews that are on the basis of this book, I interviewed somebody at whose home Avramenko had stayed with when the guy that I was interviewing was a little boy. And apparently what happened was Avramenko, to have this, almost not worse than purity, almost like Spartan existence, insisted that the mom cook him a special, like low quality, the mom made a very nice dinner, the best food she could find. No, I don't eat this stuff. And he made the mom cook a second dinner that was kind of, and this guy said, mom said this guy's never staying at our house again. Okay. So you get this sort of, you got to do this, you got to do all this stuff. And, so I had my doubts about all this Ukrainian stuff, but I had this vision of this kind of Avramenko type purity until I went out on the prairies with the Sanctuary Project. So what was the Sanctuary Project? It was the four of us who were in this picture, John Paul Himka, his daughter Eva, Francis Swadepa, and me, and whatever volunteers were willing to volunteer, and whatever grad students or students we could pay for. And we drove around the prairies. It happened to be, what we could do was Alberta and Saskatchewan for 10 years. We were documenting Ukrainian churches. You probably know, for those of you who have interest in Ukrainian material and some Ukrainian background, that Ukrainians started coming to Canada at the end of the 19th century, and there was this wave that came up to the time of the First World War, then a break at the time of the war, and then another group that came between the First and the Second World War. If you want to read about this in my book, I have lots of references. Martinovich is sort of the classic. These people were farmers. So they settled the prairies, and the people that came after the Second World War were the people like my family. Although Grandpa was an agrarian economist and very much liked his, very much, I learned how to plant vegetables and all that sort of stuff from Grandpa. He was elite. He had a PhD. He was a professor. They were the elite. They went to cities. The Sanctuary Project, dealing with the people that were on the prairies, was very much centered on the church and religious activity. Why? Because the people, it wasn't just that the people on the prairie, I'm sorry, I tend to walk around a lot and it's hard to talk into a microphone if you're kind of the jumpy uppy downy person. The people were of course very religious, but that wasn't the only thing that was going on. The church, and I've written an article on this that was published in Ukraine, the church was the center of Ukrainian identity. People like Elsie Kabulich, who was in the picture on your right, she was told that her name Olesia was not a name. You don't call kids that, you call them Elsie. So she became Elsie. They beat kids for speaking Ukrainian in school, and on and on and on. Elsie became quite an activist, and she got the Order of Canada, which she's showing in that picture. So churches were where you could go hear Ukrainian. It wasn't just a service, it was Ukrainian plays. It was kids reciting poetry. It was, Baba and Guido speaking in Ukrainian or whoever it was. It was very important culturally as well as for religious reasons. Okay, come on. Now, the church, in addition to helping preserve Ukrainian identity, was also very important in teaching Ukrainians how to adapt. You see Father Taras Udot, some of you may even know Father Taras Udot, he was an Harvard at the time, but a prairie priest would get 12 churches. How are you going to have a church a service every Sunday if you've got 12 churches? Well, you don't. So the full liturgical calendar is impossible. Not only was the lack of priests a problem, look at the roads. My husband, who actually was our mechanic, who said, where the F has she been? Because I would do things like strip the engine shield off my car. Look at the picture on the bottom. You can be driving across a Saskatchewan road and get a big surprise, like the hole in the middle of the road, without, at least on the other side, they bothered to put up a barrier. On the side that I was on, they did not. I had students in the car, and I couldn't turn around because there was water on either side of this road, so I had to back up for I don't know how many kilometers. I was shaking the whole time, fearing that I'd go into a gully with students in my car. Okay, so just a couple of examples of how the church helped people adapt. There is an after Easter event, which is called Provode. You take the joy of the resurrection of Christ out to your ancestors in the graves. Well, if you've got 12 churches, you're not going to have 12 Provode. What they do have is Praznik for the Catholics and Chram for the Orthodox, which is a celebration of the church. These vary. Smart Canadians managed to schedule them so they would be in the summer season when you don't have to deal with prairie roads. And then you combine the grave blessing of Provode with Chram or Praznik. So you get everything that you want with the limited resources that you have. So the churches were incredibly important, but we started our project, we met first time in 2008 and actually started going out to the prairies in 2009. as important as they were, the churches are closing. That's why we started. We said, we got to do something. We got to do something. So why are the churches closing if they were that important? Well, one of the things is out-migration. You get a better job, an easier job. I've never seen people with that many injuries except in the Alberta oil fields. A horse kicks you. One of the guys actually in the bottom picture, that's Roy O'Donnell, he managed to saw half his hand off with one of those circular saws. He relearned how to play the violin after that. So people, out migration to cities. Mechanization of farm work allows out migration. So Chris Zorniak in the top picture, he said, I'm able to program my tractor. I sit on the tractor, it does its thing, I'm just there. This picture is a picture of the St. Elias Church in Roxton. There was a very wealthy Ukrainian family that owned a John Deere dealership. They could build the St. Elias Church, it's huge. They moved to Yorkton, which is a much bigger place. They take their John Deere dealership with them. And as you can see, the church is in disrepair. This is 2015. I don't know if it's still standing. I follow up on these things to the extent that I can. One of the things that kind of freaked me out most of all was big corporations buying up huge tracts, including the Canadian Pension Fund, by the way, of prairie land. So the workers come in, they do their thing, and then they leave. There's no community there the way there was when people owned individual farms. And if there are 5 or 6 people left, parishioners, they can't afford to support a church. This is the closing of the church in the Church of Yaroslav in Bruderheim, Alberta. My husband, who did the filming, cried. It was so sad to see a church close. Once a church becomes a church when it's consecrated. When it's deconsecrated, it becomes an ordinary building. That one actually became a building at a Catholic camp. A lot of churches are burnt. So what you see on the right here are churches that were burnt, and then the ashes are buried very often at a graveyard or or where they were prior to their existence. So the cupola marks the place where the church ashes are buried. And this is what the Sanctuary Project was. Hinka and Sverepa did the photography. Volunteers worked with them. I interviewed parishioners. They would be told that an interviewer was coming, and anyone who wanted to talk, please come. And I asked them about family rituals, which was birth, marriage, death. I asked them about calendar, what happened to it. Well, not happened. This is what was left, is essentially Christmas and Easter. What I learned, it was in many. I can't quite, unless I jump up and down, which I have a tendency to do, but I'm sure people would be. And how interesting what I learned was. One of the things that I learned was that the wedding very, very quickly became Canadianized. So what you see on the left is a trunk that a woman, it was Ingrid Chalice's mother-in-law, had brought from Ukraine as her trousseau, including a wedding costume. She did not wear it. And even the gold leaf that was supposed to go on her vignettes was never used because she probably wore a white wedding dress. One of the first things that was kind of anglicized was the white wedding dress. And every woman I interviewed had her white wedding dress, and very often a mom's white wedding dress, and the cake. Instead of having korovai, they went to fruitcake, which is actually in England the bride's cake. Why I think the wedding was so affected was this symbolism of the wedding as the union of two families. So This was the union of two cultures. Now, they didn't necessarily marry Anglos, they very often married Ukrainians, but this idea of the union of two different things. And I said, almost every woman had her wedding dress. With the multiculturalism policy in the 1970s, the multiculturalism policy does affect rural areas, and people bring back the korovai. So you have a picture of one of them is a korovai in a church. The other more typical thing, you keep your korovai in a china cabinet. When Ukrainians come over, and I don't know how many of you are close to old country like me, when Ukrainians come over, they absolutely freak out when they see a korovai that's been desiccated and stuck in the cabinet, because if you are in Ukraine, you have to eat the whole thing or the marriage is gonna go bad. So when they see the thing dried out and sitting there, they go, did the marriage go bad? No. Anyway, and I think one of the things that happened was that for a while, instead of, they still had a white wedding cake, but it wasn't a fruit cake. Can you see that this thing is 3-tiered? The bottom tier was a fruit cake. The top 2 tiers were styrofoam. Obviously, you couldn't support a fruit cake on those nice little columns there. The upper 2 tiers are styrofoam. And you kept the uppermost tier, you handed out the lower tier, the fruit cake tier, to your guests. By the way, the fruitcake became so associated with Ukrainian weddings that some people who wanted to have a white wedding cake, forget the chocolate wedding cake, the white wedding cake, were told, no, the traditional Ukrainian cake is fruitcake. So that's one of the things that happened. This, to me, this again made a very big impression on me. Traditionally, an unbaptized person, like a baby who dies unbaptized, cannot be buried in the cemetery. The picture on the left is the one that freaked me out the most, because this unbaptized baby is buried next to the outhouse. I could show you lots of pictures of little crosses at the edges of cemeteries. What I've got in this slide on the right is the little white crosses, are the sort of typical unbaptized baby crosses. But the guy, I don't know how much you know, but if you see a gravestone with a Canadian flag, that's a veteran. So that's obviously an adult. That was Tony Hutzulak, and I asked him, what's going on here? Tony Hutzulak protested having his baby son buried outside the cemetery. So I said, my kid's going there, I'm going there. And that's why he's buried. A big change started to come around 2010, maybe even earlier. In the picture on the right, you see the sanctuary crew with Mike and Geraldine Voitas. They were instrumental in their church in getting unbaptized babies recognized. It started out with Geraldine saying, that is a bloody funny name. Why do I have a name like Geraldine? And it turned out that a brother, who apparently was baptized, or we wouldn't know his name, died as an infant, so they named her after this baby. She said, were there other babies? And it turned out there were 2 that were unbaptized that she didn't know about, and the family kind of ignored as if they never existed. And they started looking and found hospital records of lots of babies. Other parishioners started looking, and at the church where they were, where Mike and Geraldine were, they actually moved the cemetery fence to include the unbaptized graves. In other churches, they did that, where they set up things like cenotaphs with the names of the unbaptized babies whose names they knew. That's the ones on the motto. And then the plaque says, until all whose names are unknown. And this Things like this are in a number of cemeteries. So like the process of recognition of unbaptized babies is well underway. One of the things that I saw in process was the other type of burials, which are a cemetery no-no, which is suicides, and cremated remains. The suicides are more of a no-no than the cremated remains. If you would look at the picture on the left, you'll see that there's a path that's been mowed. So what they're doing is saying, this person is connected to this cemetery. They're not going to rebury this person, but they're making this path that's saying this person is ours. Very much, this is in Jedburgh, very much like Tony Hutzulak, one woman whose husband had committed suicide insisted on being buried with her husband. And she said, you know, he committed suicide because he was a nut. He was sick. If somebody who has cancer can be buried in the cemetery, why can't somebody who's mentally ill be buried in a cemetery? I'm getting buried with him. The other picture is a picture in Foam Lake. And there, a guy from Foam Lake went to Ottawa, and he died in Ottawa, but he wanted to be buried back in his home cemetery. I don't know if you know, but shipping a body across Canada is very, very expensive. So he got cremated and shipped his remains in a little box, and they wouldn't let him bury it. So the relatives went to the cemetery at night and buried his remains. This is one instance. This is one example of many. In general, this idea of burying cemeteries, I'm not being morbid, but cemeteries were much more important than I realized. So what happened was things like this. This is actually in Bruderheim. It's David Bushminski. He's taking me around a cemetery. And I said, why do they have these glass bits in the concrete that's on the cemetery stones? And he said, but do you know why they have to have cemetery stones? I said, no, why do they have to have cemetery stones? Because we don't want the dead to get up and try to go back to Ukraine. And actually, if we have time later, I can tell you why they were afraid that the dead might go back to Ukraine. But this idea of, especially for farmers, of planting seeds, the tie to the land for immigrants becomes incredibly important. Oh, please. John, we're having clicking problems again. Next slide.
How about that?
Yeah, no, this was an outfit that was given to me, which to me was been told, a lot is obviously a burial outfit. But the woman to whom it belonged was not buried, and it probably the same sort of thing. It links her back to Ukraine too much. Another thing with the land, I learned that something that I didn't think had migrated to Canada because of the weddings had, which is that I learned that Canada had wedding of the dead, which means that if somebody dies unmarried, you do this kind of, well, it's not quite a fake wedding, but you marry them to a symbolic or a living person. This continued up until the 1970s. In fact, I found paper documentation of an accident that happened in the 1970s that was treated as wedding of the dead. Very interesting woman called Nellie Holovachuk. And she was kind of an early feminist, and this was from a little town that's outside of Priestville, Saskatchewan. I interviewed her in Priestville. She had cancer, but I'm actually going on a little bit too far. She didn't want to be a Canadian prairie wife. She went to Toronto. I think she did some modeling. But she ran a hair salon, but what really made a difference was the fact that one of her salon clients taught her how to invest in the stock market. And she became incredibly wealthy. After her cancer, or actually during her cancer, if you want, she had colon cancer. So pardon me, she goes to the toilet. She looks in the mirror and she sees a vision of Christ behind her reflected in the mirror. And she said, what does Christ want? So she decides that Christ wants this life-size granite. Do you know how much granite statues cost? Anyway, so she invests all this money that she made in the stock market, first in a statue of Christ, then in a statue of Mary, Mother of God. The thing in the middle is the tomb that she makes for herself. Then she buys the statue of Mary, Mother of God, and of Christ, her life size. Then she buys 14 granite, almost life-size Stations of the Cross. Do you know how much they cost? Do you know how much it cost to ship? They were not made in Priestville. They were made in Ottawa and shipped from Ottawa. Do you know how much this cost? And I said, I want to know, I want to do what I want to do with my money. I'm not giving it to the church because I want to decide. It's a religious thing. She actually, in the book, I talk how she does conform to religion, even though she's saying, I'm deciding what I'm giving to the church, not the church deciding what it's going to do. In terms of calendary ritual, you see John Paul with the caroling star. That's the picture on the left. Now this is the caroling star. Caroling disappeared very quickly. And it's not just because of language issues, although language issues were important. It was also because of settlement patterns. I don't know how much you know about settlement patterns on the prairies, but you got a quarter section of land. You had to live on your quarter section for 3 years to retain title, which meant that this was a great method for kind of spreading people out, ignoring the indigenous population, of course. It's spreading people out and getting a large part of the prairie settled. But how do you go caroling when the next house is a mile away? Well, they did actually for a while drive. But you know, you can't walk around the way you would do in Samoa. So caroling in a city exists because you can walk from house to house or drive from house to house. But caroling in the prairies died. What mostly happens at Christmas, and I can talk more about it in the question and answer session, is a celebration in the home, which is very complicated. Easter changes a lot. Again, the celebration in the home, the celebration in the church with an Easter basket. I'm right now making Easter baskets rushniki for my church to sell. And then, you know, hopefully by Easter, I should have, it's going to be a while until Easter, so I should have a few made, sell, and then send the money to Ukraine. What they do is they make pisanki, but pisanki are not just, or even primarily not an Easter object. They are a Ukrainian object. This is Shirley Kropotnitsky. Her 2 daughters paid their way through the University of Saskatchewan with pisanki. She is indeed an excellent pisanka artist. I can tell you more about pisanka artists. See, it now means Ukrainian. It doesn't necessarily mean Easter. The picture in the middle is something called a pisanka mosaic, where you either cut or break your pisanka and then glue it back together into a mosaic. And of course, everybody has pisanka bingo. Well, maybe not everybody, but other changes and adaptations are things like, I was surprised, by the way, how many people make paski and babki in the home. But a lot of churches, including the one we went to in Edmonton and the one we go to in Waterloo, you know, you make paski, the church makes paski and babki and sells them, call it cheap, whatever. Then you get things that are non-Ukrainian, but very much tied to the church as a fundraiser, like the lottery in Weyburn. And my favorite is the snowmobile bingo. You know, snowmobile bingo again raises money for the church. Pierogies. I mentioned to somebody that Roy Collett was selling pierogies at $2.50 a dozen and managed to sell enough to re-roof the Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in Sturgis. His Pisanko workshops were very popular because they were kind of social events where even non-parishioners showed up, and they were, by the way, very good pierogies. Okay. Obzhinki, a lot of things combine a Ukrainian event with a Western event. So Obzhinki, and this is in North Battleford, happened on Thanksgiving. And they have turkey, of course, but it's a meal with lots and lots of Ukrainian food. Everybody loves Ukrainian food. They have hospodyня, traditional greetings. You come in, you get a shot of horilka, or you get, if you don't want horilka, you can have a shot of tea. They raffled off Holodomor Pisanki. This freaked me out. Pisanki, Holodomor, Thanksgiving, this kind of all doesn't make sense until I found this thing online. Stalin using a scythe to mow down Pisanki. I'm not going to take the time, since I'm running a little bit late, to talk about the Obzhinki that was started by new immigrants and why it wasn't successful in Canada. Elaine and Roman Nitschik, who ran that North Battleford Obzhinki, have very recently, because Ukrainian pipe fitters have come to North Battleford. And do I know why pipe fitters go to North Battleford? I haven't the faintest idea. But new immigrants wanted maselnitsa or masena, and they started one. So they're adapting to the people that are coming in. Probably the most popular event is Malanka. It's not Christmas, it's sort of Christmas season. So they have Christmas in the home, but every church as a fundraiser runs a Malanka, and it's not the kind of traditional Malanka that my friend Bob there recorded. Things have changed a lot. So, food, Ukrainian, of course. Ukrainian dance, it can be a performance done by kids. And then there's like regular Western music for the adults to dance to. And it earns an incredible amount of money. The kind of most successful Malanka is the one in Nipawin. It happens after Christmas. Steve and Mary Rudy, who are incredible in many ways, organized this thing, and essentially they took the entire Christmas season and kind of squeezed it into one night of fun and games. So they have a voroshka, a fortune teller. You come in, you pay, you get your fortune told. Then they had yiduk. In your house, yiduk is about this big. You take it outside and burn it. Well, you're not going to burn it something that big inside a hall in Nipawin. So they had a tiny one on a metal plate and burned that. They had, of course, meal of Ukrainian food. You got to have Ukrainian food. They had a children's dance. They had a dance for adults. And at midnight, they had the chicken prediction. Okay, now in a home, the way that you predict the harvest is with kutya, where you throw kutya. By the way, if you have stippled ceiling, Baba says, no more kutya on ceiling, cannot stick, it's very hard to clean off a stippled ceiling. The chicken prediction goes like this. You don't feed the chickens all day. Then you put a plate of water and a plate of grain in front of them, and you see what they go for. Is it going to be a rainy season, water, or a good harvest, the grain? And this was so popular that Steve told me people would come and run into him in town and say, so what did the chickens do? And you will pardon my language, one year, they go out, chickens don't go for the water, they don't go for the grain. And finally, one of them poops. And Hospodar says, it is going to be a shitty year. Okay. Anyway, it's so popular that 400 people go to this thing in Nipawin. If you remember the Broncos, do you remember the accident with the Broncos? Even I didn't have the guts to drive out there in winter. Not on those roads like I showed you. And it's 400 people would go. And so here we are. My goal was to present these people who people don't know about. Ordinary people, like Stephen Mary, like Roy, like Nellie, who most people don't know about. I wanted they're overlooked. I wanted people to know about them. As my husband and I went to a meeting of the Canadian Association of Slavists in Toronto, in York, and all the talk was about politics, and this scared me a bit. Why? Yes, politicians are very powerful. Yes, politicians are important, but what I've said any number of times, because of all this power in the hands of politicians, they're the guys that make your life miserable. Just think of Ukraine. These people that are documented, these are the ones that make your life worth living. I hope that as the war, etc., goes on, we do not forget these people. Please read about them. I wrote about them. Please read about them. I think they're wonderful. Thank you. That's the end. John, I think is going to have question time.
That's exactly correct. So if you do have any questions, please just put up your hand and I'll come over to you with the microphone. If you are watching live and have a question, please just write it in the YouTube chat. Were there any questions?
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk.
I have to stand in front of the mic, don't I?
We both have a problem with the mic.
Yeah. No, I project. I would lecture to 200 people without a mic, so I project very well, but I know for the recording, you don't wander around.
No.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of research on these various rituals in the Ukrainian community in the past. Would you dare any predictions for the future? There's been a recent, influx of Ukrainian immigrants. How do you see things in terms of these rituals for the future?
Well, I also, prior to doing this work, I spent 10 years in Ukraine. Again, pretty well every summer recording ritual. And it was that's my next book, should I live that long. The data is partially processed. I've got to write it up. What I saw, I told you, North Battleford, they're adapting. They're saying, okay, if this is really important to you, let's do it. A lot of the things, one thing that happened, I left this out, a group that came over and settled in Mundare, farmers, said, okay, we're going to do our harvest ritual, which was actually Obzhinki, but they did the Soviet version and it flopped. It really has to be a blend. I'll see what happens at our church, but our church is fairly heavy, either immigrants of my generation or the Novisha Pribuli, the most recent immigrants. What I'm assuming, I'm guessing that you're going to get some sort of a blend again. And this, I think, is what's so wonderful, that it's not kind of the politics is my way or it's not your way, it's this or that, which is very cut and dry. It is exactly a blend and a mixture. And because it is a blend and a mixture, this is what gives me the greatest amount of hope that things can be negotiated and worked out so it's meaningful to everyone.
Thank you, Natalie. We do have a question from YouTube asking, in your interviews over the years, have you come across any talk of wax healings? And if so, could you speak about what you've learned about them?
Actually, this happens, I was trained as an egg healer, but that was in Ukraine. And yes, I have heard about the wax healings. Yes, I had a wax healing done to me not too far away from Edmonton. What do you want to know? Yeah, yes, you may know Rena Hanchuk's book. If people can write to me at my email, I'll give them all the information about Rena Hanchuk's book. And also about, the various healing practices. Somebody contacted me wanting to film the healing practices in Ukraine, what people are using to deal with the war. Whether they're going to be able to do that, I don't know. A, because the war. B, because as somebody who has been trained, you kind of, you can't quite do it in the middle of things. You need to sort of get a quiet period and then go on.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your talk. It's been very, very interesting to listen to you. I do have a question regarding this, the change in the wedding rituals, because it's here in Winnipeg. I have seen actually Korovai preserved in a china cabinet, and the marriage has been extremely happy, very successful, over 50 years together. Wonderful, wonderful home, wonderful couple. But so the question is, if Korovai should have been eaten at the wedding, all of it, then how did it happen that Ukrainians here on the prairies started to sort of like, well, drying this thing and putting it in the china cabinet and displaying to the visitors like 50 years after?
Or at their 50th anniversary or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, a lot of these people were very successful marriages. There was one couple that left a huge korovai in the church. She actually managed to cure him of smoking. She was that dedicated to him. No, okay, so, well, very simply, what happens, there's a Ukrainian tradition where you gotta eat the whole thing. You give the podosra to the musicians on the line, it all disappears or else. Part of it goes to the husband's house, it all goes. But there's this break when they come to Canada. You can't have a really ceremonial korovai preparation because you have to have 7 happily married women. Well, if they live on 7 quarter sections, you're not going to get them together to make a korovai. So they stopped doing the korovai. So they're coming at the end of the 19th century between the wars. They start making the korovai in the 70s. It's not even right after the Second World War. In the meantime, they've had fruit cakes, they've had styrofoam cake. They do things like wear the white wedding dress for an anniversary. If the bride can get into it, great. If not, it's her daughter, her niece, or somebody else. It's all marking happy marriages.
So where does this idea of preserving it come from? Like it's.
I think the styrofoam cake.
Oh, okay.
I think, you see, with the styrofoam cake, you obviously didn't
Yeah,
eat
makes
this
sense.
thing.
Yeah.
But the very top, if you know Western wedding cakes, it usually has like a plastic figurine on top. So you preserve that sometimes with the top of the cake, which sometimes is successful. With fruit cake, it's a lot harder to preserve it than with the korovai. Fruit cakes are pretty wet. So sometimes they manage to preserve, a lot of times not. But the plastic thing you can preserve, and then I think you got your answer, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, hello. I'm just gonna add to that. We've been married, my wife, for 42 years, and we have the 3-tiered cake as well as the korovai, which my aunt made for us back in the early 80s. And
Did you eat your korovai?
No, we still got it. And we had it out for our daughter's wedding 7 years ago, and she's
Yes.
still happily married. And
No, they do this thing, like the same korovai is used. I didn't talk about baptismal gowns, but the same korovai is used for all family members.
And we're going to keep everybody's shocked that it's still around, so it's going to keep going down the generations. And then the real fruit cake, like you said, it did get just too contaminated.
Gooey, yes.
Didn't last at all.
No, I didn't talk about baptismal gowns. I didn't talk about krishma, which they're used. because it's Canada and because you're dealing with emigres, family ties are extremely important. So they do things like use the same baptismal gown for all the babies. And some of it they say, so for it's too expensive to buy one for every kid. And some of it is if all the siblings have the same gown, they'll be close to each other. I said, did it work? But of course. You know, or they pass the same baptismal gown onto their children and even grandchildren if they can. And a baptismal gown, by the way, is not a traditional Ukrainian object. It is a charisma. And well, let people ask questions and then I can talk about charisma if you want to know about charisma.
We do have a question from online, which is, have you heard any stories about funeral wailers? I've heard stories that this was a common occurrence at funerals but has died away. What is the reason behind them?
Okay, well, people don't like unhappy stuff. Let's put it this way. Yes, I have heard, did not run into anybody who would actually have the experience. I did run into people who remember the old women, the Staribabci, sitting over the body of the deceased. Sometimes with this spiral candle that had to burn all night. And it was exactly a spiral candle. But why? A, language. B, a lot of the unhappy stuff goes away, especially if you're in Canada. You know, what is it supposed to be? It's not supposed to be a sad occasion. You know, it's sad, but you're glad that your ancestor is going on to a better life, etc., etc. And so in weddings, the Winkelplattenya, which is disappears very quickly, to the point that one person that I interviewed said, you know, my sister cried so much at the Winkelplattenya that I said, I am not having a Winkelplattenya. People, they sing sad songs for the bride. So it helps her give up her life in her home and start a new life in the home of her husband. But the Winkelplattenya songs are sad. Maybe by analogy with getting rid of that sad aspect, we got rid of the funeral lamenters. Yeah.
Thank you for amazing presentation. I assume the books should be just excellent.
I've heard people can't put them down.
Great. I'm just curious because you're talking a lot about Ukrainian traditions, but like in the case of Italy, Ukrainians came from different Ukrainian regions.
Yes.
They brought different kind of traditions.
Yes.
I'm just curious about was this kind of as a blend of this tradition they coexist in, because from Bukovina, Halisha, you know, newcomer come from Ukraine. Even from different villages, you have different traditions. Yes. I'm just curious here in Canada.
I'm not sure I want to start on this one. There's the old joke of, why do you have two kaplitzas, two chapels on your farm? I don't go to that one. In Bruderheim, you saw the Catholic one. So the kitty corner from that is the Orthodox one. Okay, the Bukovinians were Orthodox, the Halichane were Catholic. So, you know, did they blend? Did they go to each other's churches? I'm going to keep my mouth shut. No, you know, no, they did to a certain extent. They intermarried. They tended more to, I guess, to intermarry with Anglos than to me. The Halichane intermarry with the Bukovinci. So in one area, I said, why are there Orthodox churches every 2 kilometers? Because I don't go to that one. You know, I'm sorry. You know, so some of this conflict aspect that I was trying to get away when I talked about the Kononenko syndrome. I sigh deeply and say, I wish it wasn't so, but some of that conflict did exist and continues. I mean, now that they're so small, the congregations are so small, the churches are huge in some places, they're enormous. So.
second quick question about Malak. I'm just curious why Malak is so popular in Canada. It's not so popular in Ukraine.
No, because it's a totally different Malonka. It's because it's so Canadianized that it, Bob wrote about the kind of the end of the more traditional Malonka in Canada, where people did dress up. I did interview some people who did dress up for Malonka in disguise, So, but that kind of thing, it brings, because it's Ukrainian food, because what Steve Rudy said is Ukrainian culture sells. So it's a show and they burn things and they're chickens and, it's a show that brings in as many Anglos and I don't know, indigenous people and whatever else. There are a lot of people from Southeast Asia now on the prairies, a lot of people. I don't know if it brings them in. You see, you sit back, you're writing your book, you're processing your data, and you said, you idiot, why didn't you ask that? So I know that a lot of non-Ukrainians like the Malonka. Do the people from places like Southeast Asia go to them? I don't know. That the Anglos go for is for sure and love it. Yeah.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I'm just going to return back to the Korovai. And you mentioned that there was a resurgence of Korovai making in the 1970s. Now, I'm sure we've been talking about the beliefs around and folk customs around, but you haven't addressed, or have you thought of that in the 70s and in the 80s and the 90s, the symbol of the Korovai became of utmost importance. And I think that is
symbol as a what?
As this is part of the Ukrainian tradition.
Yeah.
And you use the Korovai, your parents bless you with the Korovai.
Yes.
The traditions or the tradition of whether it's eaten or not is not as important as of what the Korovai itself represents.
Yeah, no,
it's not that a good thing.
With the influence of the multiculturalism policy, the introduction of more Ukrainian dance programs, Ukrainian summer camps, bilingual education in the schools, the two things that come back, as you said, as symbols of being Ukrainian or Korovai and Ukrainsky odyag, the costume. What do they think is Ukrainsky odyag? They think it's a dance costume. They do not bring back the costume of the area from which they came. Everybody wears the Poltavsky outfit. Most of them did not come from anywhere near Poltava. They came from the west. I come from the area near Poltava. But that typical costume with the plachta and the sorochka and the fartuk and all that sort of stuff, that is Ukrainsky odyag, and that's what they dress in. And the guy wears an embroidered shirt with a suit. So yes, it is very much a symbol of Ukraine. Did you see in the Nichik picture, they had their 3-tiered cake, 2 tiers of which were probably styrofoam, and a Korovai, because they were very, gung-ho Ukrainian couple. Oh.
And we do have time for one more question over here before we go to closing comments.
One of the blendings I've enjoyed in rural Western Canada it is the music where musical performers like Pete Pick, like in the Polka Kings, Mickey and Bunny, where they sang English songs in Ukrainian, and that they as your main theme states blended things together. Have you done any research on that?
No, actually, you'd have to ask Bob right there. You can't do everything, and music, unfortunately, is not my forte. So I don't know you don't want to hear me sing either, believe me. My husband is laughing because he knows that you do not want to hear me sing. Yeah, no, but I know, of course, about Mickey and Bunny. I know that some of our former grad students did actually do their research on this topic. If you email me, I can again help you with a bibliography or at least references to what some of the students have written on this topic. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm not sure if you have any closing comments you might like to
Do I
offer.
have closing comments? I want to thank this audience for coming, for being willing to listen to me and put up with me, for asking me lots of interesting and insightful questions. So thank you very much. Please buy the book. It'll make McGill-Queens very happy and probably make Natalie Robinson very happy as well. And I hope you enjoy it. As I said, I've been told things like you kept me up past midnight because I couldn't put it down. Even non-Ukrainian, the local politician from Kitchener-Waterloo are kind of the same town. The local politician from Kitchener read it on the plane. One of my colleagues read it on the plane. Said, "Oh well, it was so much fun. I couldn't put it down." So I hope you enjoy it. And please, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you. And now I can jump around, which I have a tendency to do. I have a very hard time standing in one place.
Thank you so very much, Natalie. We
Thank
will be
you.
moving on to the signing portion of the evening. So please do feel free to come up to the table and have a copy of your book signed. You don't need to pay for it first, but we do hope that you will pay for it before you leave the store. We're grateful to all of you for your very kind attention to McGill-Queen's University Press for publishing this book in the first place. And I'm just so grateful you could spend the evening here with us. So please join me one more time in acknowledging Natalie Kononenko.
You want mine? Okay, I need a pen.
There are some pens over
Oh,
there.
there are some pens.
If those are pens you'd like to use.
I don't want to use a Sharpie. I brought one.